Hi, I'm Melanie, and you're watching Yarn Journeys. First, I want to say welcome back to all my returning viewers. And if this is the first time you're watching Yarn Journeys, I'm so glad you found our channel. Yarn Journeys is all about combining the love of knitting, yarn, and fiber with a love of travel and adventure. Today's episode is the first of three about my recent trip to Vancouver and Vancouver Island in Canada's British Columbia. Today, I'll be telling you all about a great day out to Granville Island in Vancouver. And I'll be catching you up on the progress of my current knitting and spinning projects. Finally, stay tuned until the end where I give you my thoughts about a recently published knitting book. The city of Vancouver is located in the heart of the Pacific Northwest on Canada's west coast. My husband and I spent the first couple days of our 3-week trip there before heading to wild Vancouver Island. More on that in upcoming episodes. After flying out from our DC area home on the east coast of the US, we thought we'd spend a couple days getting used to a new time zone and exploring the city. We had unexpectedly beautiful weather, clear skies and temperatures in the 60s and 70s. While it was great weather for being a tourist, the region itself was actually experiencing a drought. British Columbia is typically several degrees cooler and rainy in the fall. The physical setting of Vancouver is a stunning combination of expanses of water with mountains rising in the distance. Our first afternoon, we enjoyed watching the seaplanes landing and taking off from the airport in the harbor. And the next morning, we went for a run to Stanley Park, where glorious totem poles reigned over the scenery. So, as many of you may already know, Vancouver is just a hotbed of knitting and fiber arts goings-on. There are more than a few world-famous yarn shops and fiber art centers in the city. Bad Anna's and Sweet Georgia immediately come to mind. Unfortunately, I really didn't have time to visit all those wonderful places and do them justice. We had just one day to be a tourist in Vancouver, so we spent the day at Granville Island, a great spot to enjoy the great food and culture of the city. To get to Granville Island from where we were staying, we took a 5-minute water taxi ride under a beautiful Art Deco bridge. A big draw of the area is the Granville Island Public Market, a huge food hall that features delicious local food vendors, as well as purveyors of local delicacies such as fresh wild-caught salmon and cod. There are plenty of spots to eat and enjoy the market, both inside and outside. We could see how much Vancouverites delight in the arts with how these old silos had been painted. And I got to hang out with a bear, and guess what? It wouldn't be the first time. Granville Island also has 2 market areas dedicated to local artisans, and I so appreciate how the city has reserved space for these craft artists rather than turn it over to your typical mass retailers who would be thrilled to have access to the throngs of tourists. My first stop was the Silk Weaving Studio, the retail outlet of Sanjo Silk, an online purveyor of raw silk, silk yarn, fiber, and textiles. The Silk Weaving Studio has been on Granville Island for over 35 years. Here, all aspects of silk processing, yarn production, weaving, as well as knitting is on display. They had everything from raw silk cocoons to complete woven silk garments with hand-dyed fibers. Many varieties of silk yarn are for sale, as well as yarn spun from combinations of silk with linen, wool, and other fibers. As a spinner with a new but as yet barely used blending board, all the unspun silk fiber called to me, and I couldn't resist a spinner's bundle of goodies to play with when I got home. The person with whom we spoke in the shop was very helpful in pointing out other stores I should stop in, both on Granville Island and further on in our trip to Vancouver Island. Nearby the silk weaving studio is the Cloth Shop, a fabric store that caters mainly to quilters. The inside featured a dazzling display of printed cotton fabrics, and I couldn't help but pick up a bunch of fat quarters with which I hope to make some simple project bags someday soon. Across from the Granville Island Public Market is the Net Loft, a mall for artisans and craft artists. It houses the Fiber Art Studio, the workspace of 5 Vancouver fiber artists for the past 45 years. The space is neatly divided between working studio space with spinning wheels and weaving looms, and retail space with hand-spun, hand-dyed yarn and hand-knit goods for sale. I had a lovely chat with one of the original founding fiber artists about how lucky she feels to be in this space and how she enjoys the delight and surprise of tourists who are also knitters upon entering the store. A skein of beautiful hand-dyed boucle yarn called out to me, and I answered that call. Finally, I stopped at Mowry, a purpose-driven retail shop that focuses on fostering slow clothes and the preservation of craft skills with natural fibers. The store sells many beautiful things, including hand-carved wood stamps and beautifully printed natural fiber textiles. Dyes and inks are also for sale, as well as undyed wool yarn. Mowry focuses on fair trade, organic, and sustainable production, having published a book called A Quiet Manifesto for the Preservation of Craft, which is for sale in the shop. And I began to wonder to myself, how is it that this city in the Pacific Northwest of North America came to be such a focus for the fiber arts? How is it that on one of the most touristed spots in the city, one can find not just one, but 3 places to find beautiful wool and fiber, all within 50 yards of each other? And a fabric shop too? I can't think of another city like that. Do you know of one? If so, let me know in the comments, and I'll put that on my list of places to go. So I'm going to give you a closer look at some of the goodies I brought home with me from Granville Island. So first is the spinner's bundle I got from the Silk Weaving Studio. And I apologize for the crinkle of the plastic in advance. I kind of don't want to take things out of their plastic too far because there's some fluffy stuff in there and it could get out of control. So some of the fibers are dyed, and they're all dyed in the same colorway, which will be make it easier for me to blend things up. So first, this is silk and wool, and it's very nice and slippery. I love this sort of peachy red with a little bit of gray. So that's that. It looks like it's top, I believe. So, feels good. This is Bombyx silk. So this is dyed silk fiber just by itself. I love how shiny it is. So pretty. This is silk mawata, which is another kind of silk preparation. This one has even a little bit of blue and gray, very soft, looks like there's like little bits of neps in there. It has a bit more texture in it, but it still feels very soft. This is combination silk and camel. And it feels, well, it feels like touching a cloud. So, beautiful. And then this is Angora fiber, not Angora goat, Angora rabbit. I've never actually even knit with Angora, let alone spin with it. So that will be interesting. But I think I'm going to need a little bit more education about how to handle these materials on my blending board before I start to spin with it. But when I'm ready, I am super psyched to start working with those materials. At the Fiber Art Studio, I got this lovely alpaca boucle that's hand dyed by Penny Stewart. It is super soft. I'm going to actually undo the skein. It is, I know that boucle is having another moment. Hasn't been an in thing for a while, but this is just beautiful. It isn't too stripy. I think it will just be gorgeous knit up into a hat or a shawl or some other accessory, but it struck me as very special and something that I wanted to bring home with me. And of course, I also got the fat quarters from the cloth shop. I particularly liked this print that had birds and butterflies. I think that'll make some sort of lovely bag. I want to make a whole bunch of small drawstring bags for like small projects, and I think these kinds of things are perfect for that. And now it's time for some show and tell. Here's the status update of my weekender sweater that I'm making with my hand spun. So here's the deal with my weekender sweater. I believe I showed in my last episode that I had cast on with my hand spun. This hand spun is from my Tour de Fleece Targhee that I worked on all through July and even into August. I frogged it. Yep, I had gotten to 15 inches from the cast on. It's knit from the bottom up, and it was just way too wide. So what I had done is, of course, I was a good girl and I did my swatch, and then I measured my swatch, and my gauge was way, way off. Partly because the yarn that I spun was more bulky and thick than the worsted that Andrea Mowry's The Weekender pattern actually calls for. So what I figured I would do is rejigger the sweater math, and figure out, okay, given this is what my gauge will be according to my swatch, this is how many stitches I should cast on and so forth. Well, my swatch was kind of wrong. And so I knit up to my 15 inches, and I was thinking to myself, man, this is looking really wide. This is looking really wide. And I was eating up yarn, and I thought that I would have more than enough hand spun to complete the sweater, and I was going through skein after skein. Oh boy. So before I frogged it, I took gauge measurements in 4 different places throughout my knitting, and my gauge was actually closer to what is called for in the sweater than was in my gauge swatch. Okay, and I was like, how did that happen? Well, it happened. So what I ended up doing was just, calling it like, this sweater, as I'd knit it so far, is not fixable. So I frogged it out, rolled the yarn up into balls. I hope I don't regret it, but I didn't refinish the yarn because Targhee is super stretchy and resilient, and it didn't seem to have really gotten super kinked up. So I recast on, and after some thought, instead of just redoing the sweater math all over the place, what I did was cast on for a smaller size, expecting that with my gauge, it would end up closer to the size I wanted. The sweater is supposed to have 10 to 12 inches off your bust measurement. Well, my knitting had about 16 inches, and that was just going to be huge, not look good, bad. So I am hoping that by knitting one size smaller than I thought, that I'll get a sweater that will fit me closer to like I expect. So what I've done so far is just the ribbing for the back hem. It's 2.5 inches. Hang on. It's 2.5 inches high so far. And if I did do, that's actually the side that's not going to face out. What I did is, of course, the tubular cast on. So instead of doing Andrea's tubular cast on method, where you do a kind of a long tail cast on where you alternate knits and purls, I ended up doing just a plain provisional cast on, where you knit into the provisional cast on, and there's a series of steps that you do, and once you get past them, you remove the provisional cast on, and you have a lovely tubular cast on. Even though it required a couple extra steps, I really like the result. It actually feels neater and tighter to me, and the cast on method was just more straightforward. I'd like to thank Jen Perocchini for teaching me how to do a tubular cast on when I was at the Shenandoah Valley Fiber Festival in September. Have you ever had an experience like this where you got so far in a sweater and then you had to rip it out? As I mentioned in my very first episode, I've definitely knit the too big sweater before, and I was determined not to do that again. I am also finishing up the socks that I cast on and worked on during my 3-week trip to Vancouver and Vancouver Island. Here's one finished sock, and I have turned the heel and am now working on the foot of the second. I'm not going to go into too much detail about these socks here because in the next couple of episodes I go into more detail and you'll see me working on them. But the pattern is Stephen West's latest sock pattern, the Dustland sock. I had originally cast on for a different sock pattern by a different designer, and I mentioned that in my last episode, but I changed my mind, and you can hear more about that in my next episode. I've also gotten back to my wheel and started spinning again. So I think with spinning, a lot of it is about just daily practice and getting into the sort of daily routine of working on it almost every day. Otherwise, your fingers and your feet and your coordination. I noticed when I got back to my wheel after a long time away from it, I felt a bit clunky and uncoordinated and not quite right. So instead of like focusing on spinning for a project right now, I'm really just trying to get into a daily practice of spinning at least 15 minutes a day. So this fiber is some beautiful silk and merino fiber that was a gift with purchase with my spinning wheel. So I got my spinning wheel back in the end of February, March, my ladybug, which I love. And a person who sold it to me also put in a bunch of fiber in the box. And I was not expecting that, so it was a lovely gift. This merino and silk, which is mauve and silver and brown, it is just gorgeous. The person put a little sticky note on the plastic bag saying, "Use lots of twist." And it's pretty slippery. I don't know the actual ratio of wool to silk, but my plan with this fiber is I'm working on spinning a consistent thin singles. And then when I've done 2 bobbins of singles, I will apply it together for hopefully something that will work for, that might be sport or fingering. I hope to make perhaps a lace shawl with that, because I think that the fiber is actually turning out really sort of this silvery color with a pink sheen to it. And I think that would be really, really pretty in a lace shawl. So, and in fact, you can tell I kind of like silver and pink together. This, of course, what I'm wearing is my version of Andrea Mowry's Birds of a Feather shawl. The yarn is mohair and merino silk singles, and I got it at Le Petit Point Parisien when I was last in Paris about 11 months ago. So I'm introducing a new section to my Yarn Journeys videos called Book Corner. In this bit, I aim to share with you books and other knitting related articles from which I am finding inspiration. Today's first installment of Book Corner features Patty Lyons' book, Knitting Bag of Tricks. You may already have heard about this book because it is all over the knitting interwebs these days. Have you heard about it? Let me tell you. In my opinion, it is totally worth the hype. I love Patty's sense of humor while she imparts wisdom, but even more, she offers fixes to things that have been bugging me for a while. For example, why is it that knit 2 together looks so nice and neat, but a line of SSKs looks so jagged? They're supposed to mirror each other, but they really don't. Patty addresses this issue head on and shows how to do an SSK that lays nice and flat and matches your knit 2 together. And she also explains why. Lots of good stuff in here, and I look forward to implementing her helpful tricks in my knitting going forward. Plus, she's coming to my local yarn shop, Fiberspace, in December, and I've signed up for one of her workshops. Stay tuned, and I'll tell you all about it. So, that's it for this episode of Yarn Journeys. I'll be putting links to all the shops and resources I mentioned in the description. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out in the comments. And if you enjoyed this episode, please do give it a like by hitting that thumbs up button. And please do subscribe if you don't want to miss another episode of Yarn Journeys. Stay tuned, because next time we take the ferry and head to Vancouver Island. Thanks for watching Yarn Journeys, where it's all about you to you from around the world.